ask what happens when monetary policy meets the technological change, what kind of challenges it poses, especially for central banks in a small open economy. So we're living in a world with enormous technological change. It's affecting our lives dramatically. Now, as a central bank myself until last year, conservatism is an asset for central bankers, but I'm afraid that even central bankers will have to adjust to the new technology. And but if you look at the slide, I don't think that, I mean, this is a Chicago view, but I don't think we're heading that way. What I'd like to say is that I think monetary policy will still be important, and as long as we stay tuned to these changes. So there are many changes occurring around us, and I'll focus just on two because they're just every day. I mean, every day something else comes up. But I'll focus on two, which I think some attention has already been given to. The first is all this digital currency and distributed ledger technology, which is actually something we've seen for the last 10 years with the Bitcoin. And it's something that's gathering momentum and speed in the financial community. And the second one, which is also something which has been around for a few years, but also is gathering momentum, is the reduction of market frictions and due to technological change mainly. So I'll start with the first. And so the challenge for monetary policy is the cryptocurrencies. Is there still a role for central bank money, or whether the world will be dominated by cryptocurrencies? So if you look at the at what happens to Bitcoin, the valuation of Bitcoin over a year, it doesn't seem like a very good candidate for to replace national currencies. On the other hand, what the response of central banks should be and is for these developments is basically that central banks have trust in their currencies. And the session before, we heard from all the speakers how important trust and credibility are for central banks. So I think the way central banks respond to this is by what the asset they have is trust. And actually the central bank can create this digital currency backed by trust. Now, what do we mean by trust? This is what I mean by trust, is looking at the 5 to 10 year inflation expectations. Again, is something that was discussed quite extensively in the previous session, is look at this stability and just remember the Bitcoin graph. And this is what central banks can offer. And to my esteemed colleague, a former colleague in the Monetary Policy Committee, when I see this graph, I give an A+, not an F. Oops. Okay, so technology. Yeah, we'll get that. Yeah, okay. So actually, what we will see is probably the response that already Sweden is ahead with is this central bank digital currency that will enjoy the trust of the central banks that we accumulated all these years and hopefully will maintain. The other problem with digital currency, and more so with the distributed ledger technology, is that the challenge is that this distributed ledger technology might diminish the role of banks in the financial system and actually undermine the monetary transmission mechanisms. There's a lot of talk about this right now from the IMF and so forth about this potential challenge. And, okay, now hopefully this will work. Technology, yeah, this is backward technology. Okay, so this is a simple diagram of the monetary transmission. You have a central bank, banks, inside money, outside money. We've all seen this in our basic macro. And the thing with the distributed ledger technology is, well, this is not, yeah, it's the old technology that has to work. And that the banks will disappear more or less. I mean, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but with this technology, there's a potential that the banks will disappear or their role will be diminished. And then the question is, how does monetary policy affect the economy without the banks' intervention or being an intermediary in the process? So the response is that, again, some people that talk about the distributed ledger technology compare the Bitcoin and the distributed ledger to the commodity money. There's no more bank money, or what you call this inside money. And again, here I put on my hat as an economic historian, and I worked a lot about commodity monies in medieval economies. With my colleague Yossi Sierra, we have this paper that actually shows that, and this is just a figure, it's not, I'm not going to talk about commodity monies, that actually you can conduct monetary policy and have almost all the spectrum of monetary phenomenon under a commodity money regime. So the fact that there are no banks doesn't mean that you cannot run a monetary policy, and monetary policy should not be responsible for the things it should be responsible for. So we're moving on to the second phenomenon I was thinking about talking about, and that's the reduction of market frictions. And so we start with the reduction of transaction costs, where we see growing goods and services market integration. So there's the famous diagram from the Bank of Israel Review about the packages sent to Israel, but this is another diagram which is a little bit more global, which is the share of Amazon's GDP or revenue out of OECD GDP. And okay, the percentages are quite small. This is just an index, and Amazon is just one company. It's a big company, but you can see that something is rapidly changing, and the pace of change actually increased after 2009. A similar way to look at things, which is not just Amazon, is the fact that the share of services in the trade account as a proportion of goods trade is actually, again, on the rise. So we can no longer, I mean, we can still talk about this, but in the future it'll be harder to talk about non-tradable goods, about central banks targeting non-tradable versus tradable and so forth. Everything looks to be tradable, or at least will be tradable at some point, including services. And so this is a challenge for central banks. Another thing where technology helps is not just the reduction of transaction costs through trade, but also what we call the information revolution. The fact that markets are moving at a rapid pace towards what we economists teach in Econ 1 or basic micro, which is the perfect information economy. So this is just an example from a British website looking at Kellogg's cornflakes, and you have the prices in various stores, all the nutritional information, and at least as far as standardized goods like cornflakes are, the world is actually, this thing we call asymmetric information problem is diminishing in many markets. Now, what are the implications of this for monetary policy? So one thing, and we've noticed that, and Nadine discussed that, and when I was at the research department, I remember doing a lot of work on this too, is first of all, inflation becomes global in the sense that it's really hard to hide behind non-tradable goods or as buffers and so forth. Everything is sort of tradable impact. There's information flows, trade flows, and so forth that make the world, in that sense, a closed economy, if you would, in some sense, of the entire world. That relates to the debate about the flattening of the Phillips curve. Now, we observe, or at least it's observationally equivalent, that we see a flat Phillips curve. We see that inflation is stuck while employment is changing. Again, if you look at the US, it may be no longer that strong, but that's something that worries everybody. But again, going back to what we learned in Econ 1 or in basic macro, is that when markets become perfect, actually these frictions that generate the upward sloping AS curve or the Phillips curve actually diminish. And what we eventually see over time is that the room or the inflation output trade-off will diminish as markets become more perfect. Again, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's something that central banks thinking about the future should have in mind, that perhaps this inflation output trade-off might not be something that you could exploit in the future. So to conclude this very brief kind of a teaser into looking into the future, I guess what would you recommend as now I'm an academic, so I can recommend policymakers what to do. And that's the benefit of being an academic, is what are the policy recommendations? So I think I echo the things that were said before, and I think that no matter what are the conditions, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, now, or in the future, monetary policy is essentially about having independence and trustworthy or credible policy. Yankele Frankel, who spoke before, had a list of a lot of these other conditions. So I'm not arguing that these are sufficient conditions, but these are necessary conditions. Whether the government is responsible or irresponsible, the central bank should maintain these things. Whatever the environment is, both in terms of those things that Yakov put on, or technology. So guidance forward is you have to deal with all this technology, you have to make the adaptations, but you still have to preserve as a necessary condition this independence and trust. Okay, so that concludes the formal part of the presentation. And now I'll introduce the guest of honor of this conference, Dr. Karnit Flug, the governor. And I want to start, first of all, I guess it's going to be, it might be like a shopping list, but I worked with Karnit for 6 years at the bank, and out of those 6 years, 4 years with Karnit as a governor. And I'll give you a little bit of my perspective at the things that she accomplished at the bank. So first of all, in continuation of my last slide, she definitely protected and preserved and maintained those essential things of a central bank: independence and creditworthiness and trust. I think that's should be said up front. This is the most important thing. But as you'll soon see, and I'm not going to bore you because there are a lot of things, but I'll say just the ones I think are really important, things that I view as achievements of Karnit as a governor. So starting with the monetary policy and moving on from these basic essentials. So first of all, I think it's, and as a member of MPC, I saw it every week, is this notion of responsible moderation, is not taking all kinds of extreme steps. And I think this was this sort of policy started with Stan, but it's not just taking an extreme step, but also having this pluralistic, holistic approach to monetary policy by mixing and matching all kinds of policies, not taking any of them to the extreme. So Nadine showed us before those pillars of the interest rate policy, the FX intervention, and these things we inherited from Stan. But then we came up with forward guidance, and also, and this was not mentioned, which is not a strict part of monetary policy, but it was always in the background, is these macro-prudential measures. So I think there was, and none of these measures was pursued to any extreme. And in the whole, they delivered, essentially, as I showed you before, that the essential target of a central bank, maintaining the credibility of long-term expectations at those 2%, which is currently the game in town. When the game will change, I'm sure the bank will do whatever it is to get there. But right now, this is the game in town. This was achieved. And again, without taking an extreme measure. Further developments that were made on the monetary front is, again, related to forward guidance, is starting a more open communication channel with the markets and with the press. So it started a little bit wobbly in the first, I was part of that too, but I hold all responsibility. It's not for any mishap there, but we started a little bit wobbly and gained experience with those things. And I think that in hindsight, it was a step forward for the bank. And again, Karnit led this process. So it's not just about communication, but also about, it's also about transparency and accountability. So not only there was a press conference, but more recently, the format of the interest rate decision minutes and so forth changed, providing more data. And so this is a step forward in terms of making the bank more transferable, more accountable. Another measure that was taken was the switch from 12 decisions to 8 decisions. And again, this might look trivial, but I remember at the time, this was like a major, it's like in Hebrew we say, Kriyat Yam Suf, the parting of the Red Sea. And again, this is something that that was achieved during Karnit's. This thing is going on its own, or you're okay? This is technology. Okay, this is again something that Karnit led. If we talk about financial stability, I'm moving through, and excuse me if I'm missing some things because I wasn't here at the bank for a year, so there's probably more things you've done already that I haven't seen. Financial stability issues. So again, macro-prudential measures, a major concern. Now there's a lot of talk now in the central banking community about central banks putting more weight on financial stability. And again, this is something that was always there with Karnit. There was this push for a financial stability committee that unfortunately I heard, I mean, not that much involved. We'll probably have to wait for the next governor. But I think, as we know, reforms in Israel take a long time, and you have to keep pushing until it happens. But Karnit definitely pushed and shoved to get this thing through. Talking about reforms, so I think the bank took what is historically a big change towards encouraging competition and in the financial system. First, by providing a credit bureau to reduce information costs, information asymmetries in the credit market, but also participating in a prudent and prudential way in the reforms that were initiated by the Ministry of Finance. So we kept an emphasis on not going through the reforms, but actually doing them prudentially and keeping in mind the stability issues, not just the competition, but without giving up on competition. And again, there are a lot of reforms down the road that have been achieved through this period. As an economic advisor, I think that, and I guess by now Karnit is world renowned for this, is this insistence of inclusive growth, which has become now the buzzword everywhere. And I think that Karnit from day one, I think when we met, I think when she was governor the first year, for the first few months, this talk about tzmicha machlila, inclusive growth, was always on the table. And again, this is a concept that, like these reforms, is something they have to push and push and push, and eventually it sinks in. And now everybody's talking about it. Impact investing, all this kind of stuff. Everybody's talking about these things. And not just central banks and international organizations, but even private entities, banks, private firms are all interested because they understand this is the key for stability. And again, Karnit was one of the pioneers in this. And finally, something that most of you might not be aware of, but I was very much part of and aware, is Karnit's reforms in terms of managing the bank, making the management decisions more open, seeking advice from the managers of the bank. And I think that's another courageous step for a governor to have more input and more pluralistic decisions in terms of the running of the day-to-day bank. So this is a short list, and it could be much longer. I put down a lot of things, which for the sake of time, I'm not going to continue. But as you can see, with a platitude of zero interest rates for years, and apparently, as Nadine said, you go to the bank, you say, what are you doing at the bank all day? You keep interest rates at zero. I hope to convince you that this list, which is not conclusive, shows you how much and how dynamic was the bank under Karnit's leadership throughout this period in many, many aspects. And before I introduce you, I'll say something a little bit more of the personal things that, having worked with Karnit for all these years. So first of all, as a governor, the first thing I could say is that she was a leader. So all these reforms, and again, it seems like nothing was done from the outside, zero interest rate, but a lot of leadership is involved in running the Monetary Policy Committee, getting the consensus. All these things I talked about require strong leadership. Another thing that you probably all know, but and I think was said before, but she's very calm, rarely gets under stress. So I think that's it's human sometimes to be stressful, but I think Karnit was very calm, and I think that's again a quality of leadership that was really important for us at the bank. She was also very accessible. Anyone can talk to her. You can always go into her office, talk about things. And she also shows a lot of empathy when you discuss all kinds of issues, from managerial problems, policy problems, and even personal problems, which again, doing all these things, she could still find time to be a human being, to be accessible, and listening and emphatic. As I said before, she does things in moderation, but she's also a moderator in terms of trying to get consensus. And I think those two qualities are not necessarily the same, but she has both of them, both being a moderate, but also acting as a moderator. And that's another value. And again, the dynamism of all these changes that was done just shows you how open-minded she was as a governor of making all these changes. And finally, she was a very good friend of mine. So with that, I'll call up Karnit to conclude this conference.